Well, I've been interested in the Middle East for a long time, just partially out of general interest, partially out of personal interest, and then 9/11 was obviously a traumatic and impactful moment for everyone, but me included, and it became very clear very quickly that that was going to be all about America's interactions with the Middle East over the years that would follow, and so that was my general sort of introduction interest to the Middle East. I sort of had always paid attention, and then on 9/11 it became clear this was going to be a central aspect of all of our lives. In specific, I came to this project more or less through happenstance. I was in graduate school, and I was having a conversation with a friend and colleague of mine who works in media production, which is something that I've done previously and still do a little bit. And I was talking to him, and he started talking about this interesting thing his boss had done. And he called his boss in, we had this conversation, and the boss is this guy by the name of Charlie Stewart. He's a sort of a veteran old newsman, and he had been sent by the American government over to the West Bank, into the Palestinian territories, to provide instruction and training for a news organization over there. Called the Ma'an Network, and ultimately the Ma'an Network would be one of the main case studies in my book. So I had this conversation with this sort of veteran American newsman, and what really struck me is that he had been sent over to the Middle East in order to sort of provide what I would call ideological instruction, kind of about the ethics of newsmaking, the ethics of media, the ethics of journalism. But when he got there, what he found were these incredibly savvy, smart, sophisticated journalists and media makers and filmmakers. And there wasn't an ideological problem, it was a practical problem. They needed help trying to figure out how to work with equipment that is not standard. They needed help trying to figure out how to schedule in the middle of an occupied space that's sort of a consistent kind of low-intensity warfare space. It was all about practicality. Right, so I had this conversation. He had been sent over to talk about ideas and ethics, but in reality, it was all about getting things done on the ground. And this struck me as an interesting disconnect. Right, that the American government had this idea that we need to improve media across the world on a sort of abstract level. But when it actually came into effect, it was all about solving on-the-ground problems. And so this was my first introduction to it. I was actually really intrigued by it. Me and Joe Sousa, the colleague of mine who introduced me to Charlie Stewart, decided we wanted to make a documentary about this institution, the Ma'an Network, based on the information we got from Charlie Stewart. And so I actually just showed up one of the summers I was in graduate school over in the West Bank with a camera and said, I want to make a documentary about you guys. And I did it. It took a couple years. And over the course of that project, I got to see that, yes, there is sort of an abstract ideological element. America is trying to get a certain sort of media made in a place like the West Bank. But really, it's about people working under these really difficult, interesting, sometimes dramatic, sometimes traumatic situations. And what I wanted to do with the book was, yes, talk about the abstract stuff, talk about the ethics and the ideology, but even more so talk about the people and talk about the fact that foreign policy is not a matter of writing things down on paper. It's a matter of doing things in practice, and that's even more so in the case of media. Right? We think of media as an abstract, sort of symbolic good, but it gets produced by real people doing real things. And so I was introduced very fortunately and sort of by happenstance. I went and made this documentary, and I was hooked on it. I just really, I love the ideas, I love the complexity of it, but I also love the people, and I wanted to tell their story. This is an academic book, and so it is fundamentally about ideas. Right? It has to be about ideas. That's what we do at the most basic level. But what I am really proud about, and what I personally really like about the book, is that you meet people, you get to know people, and hopefully I do a good job of kind of giving you their circumstances so you can understand why they do what they do and how they do what they do. And so there's characters here. Most of them are either people located in the West Bank, in the Palestinian territories, or in Kabul, Afghanistan. And they're all people who work with American funding. They all take American money, but do their own creative work, their own creative media making. They make radio, they make TV, they make films. And so you meet people who are working under different sets of restrictions, different circumstances, different challenges. And I can just give you a few examples. At the beginning of the book, I introduced you to a character by the name of Mohammed Fawzi Ghanayem. He is he's a Palestinian filmmaker, cinematographer, gaffer, sound man, kind of he'll do everything. I introduce him in this book in part by the challenge of putting together a game show with American funding, but under this really sort of restrictive, difficult situation. He lived at that point in the West Bank, occupied space. Travel was really difficult. And what you see with him is the incredible ability for people to take limited resources and really aspire towards tremendous goals when they're forced to do so, when they have no other choices. So he is there with a limited budget, with restrictions coming from the American government about what can be in the show and what can't, and he's driving around the West Bank finding discount stores and borrowing stuff from friends, and he puts it all together, and remarkably, him and a big team of people put together a show that looks like a first-class game show. You meet a number of really interesting young Afghan filmmakers and television producers. There's a man by the name of Ghaffar Azad. He was, as a young man, he had to leave Afghanistan. He fled the Taliban into Iran, where he sort of became inspired by the Iranian art cinema world. And then after the Taliban was removed, he came back and started working in television in Kabul. And so he's this really interesting character in that he's working for a station which is funded in large part by American money, which has sort of like really traditional American aesthetics to it, but also, an idea at least that it's going to advance American interest to a certain extent. And yet his instincts are all about Iranian art film and these things that really challenge American aesthetics. So he will produce a drama. He'll do it with an American vetted script, a script that comes from the U.S., reads somewhat like propaganda. But in doing so, he'll insert all these really challenging aspects into the movie or into the TV show that you wouldn't expect to see because he's young, because he was inspired by his young experiences, youthful experiences. And what comes out is this really complicated and interesting kind of combination where it is American propaganda. He's making stuff that comes, it's funded by the American government, it has messages that the American government wants there to be, but you also have his artistic instincts coming in and sort of shining through. You'll meet a number of extremely young people in Afghanistan, like really, really young people doing really important media work. One of my favorite experiences from the book was going to Kabul in Afghanistan, and I showed up at the production studio for Tolo TV. Tolo TV is a major national television network. It was originally funded by the American government, and in some ways, it operates like a real big-time station. It has millions of viewers. It has famous brand-name TV shows like The Voice, or they have an American Idol-style show, a Pop Idol-style show. But it's also being made in Kabul, in a country that is still, in a state of essentially perpetual war. There's constant threats of violence and constant eruptions of violence. And so I show up at this TV station, and I want to interview the producer of the Afghan version of Minute to Win It. Minute to Win It is like I said, a silly little game show where you play little mini games and win prizes. I believe it's an NBC show here in America. It's an American TV show. People watch it here. I wanted to meet the producer of the show in Afghanistan, the head producer. So I walked into the studio, and there's nobody there except this kid. And it's like, hey, couldn't be older than 22, 23 years old. I walk up to him and I say, could you introduce me to I'm here to see the producer of the show. And he raises his hand. He says, it's me. I said, how old are you? He's 22 years old. I'm sort of amazed that this is the man who's producing the show that's going to be viewed by millions of people. And then I say, oh, well, that's amazing. I also want to talk to the producer of The Voice. Could you show me him? And he kind of looks around and he goes, that's me. So you produce both of these shows? And it's true. This guy, his name is Habib Amiri. He was at the time 23 years old. He did it until he was about 25. He produced 2 shows in Afghanistan, watched by tens of millions of people in aggregate. In America, you'd have to be 55 years old and have dozens of credits to your name and years of experience to get anywhere near one of those jobs. And he was doing it there. And there are unique historical circumstances that made that possible, and that's part of what the book details. But it's also just a fascinating guy. It's just a guy who's living a life that, I teach 22-year-olds. They're not ready to produce shows for millions of people, but he's in a different situation. There's an aspect of the book based on gender, looking at the concerns of gender. You'll meet Amira Hanania, who is a Palestinian journalist and television host. She was a person who got her start more or less with American-funded television stations, and it's sort of a story that kind of shows the strengths and weaknesses of the kind of media that I write about. On the one hand, she was empowered. She really was empowered by American support. The fact that America was involved in funding media there sort of gave cover to people who wanted to advance gender equality. And so you see her, for example, now she hosts a TV show in which she sits across from Jordanian generals and major politicians from the Arab world and asks them really pointed questions. As a youngish woman, when she was very young, she was doing this in her 20s, and so on the one hand, you see her sort of really getting, I think, a real benefit from American influence, but you also see some of the shows she works on and some of the things they're not allowed to talk about, or they weren't allowed to talk about when she was working directly with American funding, and you see it kind of cuts both ways. That there are freedoms that are given by American intervention, but there's also red lines, things that can't be discussed. So the conceptual contribution of the book, the sort of abstract, not too abstract, but more sort of conceptual idea that I'm trying to drive through in the book, is the idea of what I describe as soft-psy media. So my thesis in the book is that there is something different about the way that America has done what I call media intervention, or what you might call media assistance into the Middle East since 9/11. So historically, America had a tendency, and they still do this to a certain extent, to kind of make sort of a purer form of propaganda, in which America would do things like create fake radio stations that were supposed to be one thing but were really another. So for example, during World War II, America set up radio stations that they claimed were being run by German resistors, but in fact were run by American soldiers out of Switzerland. And into Cuba, this is something that America's done consistently. In Cuba, America has produced media that was really produced by Americans, but was sort of made to look like it was produced locally. In Iran, this was done also. Anti-revolutionary radio stations were set up and broadcast into Iran, trying to give the impression of local resistance to the Iranian regime, but in fact, it was being sort of all orchestrated by the Americans. So that's a more traditional and it might seem nefarious, it might be nefarious, use of media in order to try to influence the world. All right, soft-psy media, which is what I write about in this book, is a little bit different. It's actually a lot different. It's a form of media that, yes, it is an American attempt to use media in a foreign country in order to change things there. But it's not done secretly. It's not done under the table, and it's not done through coercion. It's done through partnership and leveraging of resources. So essentially, soft-psy media is the combination of two bigger concepts, two other concepts that come together. One is soft power. Soft power is the idea that by giving people across the world choice and information and ideas, you can have them come to their own conclusions that the American way of doing things is better. This is, the idea of offering consumer choice across the world is thought to benefit America because it serves as a means of fostering capitalism and ultimately leading towards a sort of choice-based democratic society. That's soft power. Soft power is the idea that you empower local people, you give them the opportunity to make choices that are in American interests. That's the soft and soft-psy. The psy in soft-psy comes from psy-ops. And psy-ops refers to sort of more direct, sometimes secretive efforts of the government to influence foreign populations. Soft-psy media is when these things come together. And so, for example, you'll have a television station in the West Bank, which on the one hand is funded by the American government and told, don't say this, avoid this topic, we don't want to hear about this. That's kind of psy-ops-like. It's sort of trying to directly influence what messages are being produced. But there's a softness to it also. So the TV station in the West Bank might be told what not to say, but it won't be told so much what to say. It'll actually be encouraged to come up with its own ideas, to find out what works in that market and attracts an audience, what works in order to get local people to actually want to watch it. It won't be done secretly. It's not as though you can't find out that America is funding it. It's actually on the end of the credits. It'll say America helped produce this. Right, so soft-psy media is this attempt to give local people creativity and encourage them to operate in sort of a market system where they're trying to acquire an audience. They're trying to create programming which is attractive. They're trying to do things that locally is exciting, that locally gets people to want to watch. But at the same time, they have to follow a certain set of rules, a certain set of discursive ideas America doesn't perhaps want mentioned, some that they do want mentioned. And it's the attempt to balance this, where on the one hand, there's local freedom and creativity, and on the other hand, there are restrictions. And this is very different from something, for example, like Voice of America. Voice of America is an attempt to influence via media, but it's all produced in the United States or by Americans, by employees of the U.S. government. Soft-psy media is produced by locals with some supervision, but not direct instruction, not direct, there's nobody from the government sitting over your shoulder. So that's the idea. And the result is very different. On the one hand, you get programming which is a lot more attuned to local concerns, not just in terms of the political concerns, but sort of aesthetic concerns, the kinds of styles people like, the kinds of humor that people like. It's much more easily weaved in when you have actual locals doing the production. It also creates the possibility for what I describe in the book as some really, I think, interesting opportunities for resistance, where people are given some latitude. They're given American funding. They're given a general mandate of what movie they should produce, what TV show they should produce, but they're not being watched so closely that if they want to slip things in, even some things that the American government might not want in there, they can't do so. They actually can. There are definitely opportunities, and I describe these in the book, in which people are taking the freedom and pushing the art that they're making in directions that the American government does not foresee and maybe doesn't even want. But the entire system is meant to operate by giving local freedom, even sometimes saying things that the American government isn't so excited about if it gives the overall project legitimacy. And so this is a system that encourages people to work in an American mode, but gives enough freedom that they actually sometimes surprise you. There are people who I describe in the book. There's a guy by the name of Salim Dabor, who's a Palestinian filmmaker. He spent a lot of his life making movies, making TV shows with American funding, following American rules. But as I argue in the book, part of why he was doing this was to develop skills so that he could make his own films that didn't follow the American rules. And he sort of put it together. He took the American funding. He didn't break any of the agreements, but he was doing it for his own reasons. And he was able to do so because he had freedom. He was able to push things and learn what he wanted to learn. I talk about a radio producer in Afghanistan named Mirvais Social. And Mirvais sort of took the American imperative to do things in a free market commercial system to an extreme, and he just pushes every commercial imperative possible. The American government says go and find an audience, and he will do things that are sort of outlandish and very unusual and sort of breaking intellectual property rules and things like this. But when they try to stop him, he goes and he says, "Look, you told me to be a capitalist. So what am I doing?" And he's being more capitalist than the capitalists. Right? These sort of opportunities for people to play with the rules, to advance their own interests, exist because it's not a system of propaganda. It's not a system where the U.S. government tells people what to say. It does give a set of restrictions, but mostly what it does is it gives money to people who the U.S. government has some faith will produce good stuff. And as long as they mostly produce that good stuff, good being what the U.S. wants to see, sometimes they can break the rules, bend the rules, do things that are unorthodox or even against American policy prescriptions and still get away with it. My approach in this book was to be on the ground as much as I possibly could. When you read about international relations, when you read about media theory, you often get really top-down viewpoints. And that can be really good. You sort of can get a sense of the economics, you get a sense of the overall politics. I wanted to have some of that, but what I really wanted was to bring it down to the ground. And so this book was done largely by first-hand observational research. So I spent about somewhere between a year and a half in the West Bank, getting to really know local producers, watching them day to day, being with them long enough that they were bored by my presence and hopefully stopped acting. Were able to be a little bit more natural just because I was there over and over again, just kind of became part of the situation. You never fully disappear, but trying to be there enough to really see how things work when people are going about their normal day. I was in Afghanistan for about about 5 weeks, less time than I wanted to be, but a long enough stay that as long as I concentrated my efforts, I was able to really get to know people. And as a result, the book is every bit as much about people as it is about ideas. I developed this concept of soft-psy media. I think it's useful. I think it's helpful to understand big ideas about American policy. But much more so, what I want the book to convey is the real-life, concrete, on-the-ground circumstances of the people that you'll read about if you take a look at the book. The local producers, the people all the way from the CEOs and CFOs of the TV stations to the guy who lugs around the camera equipment. And part of what I want to argue in this book is that those experiences they cannot be separated from the big questions of politics. They can't be separated from the big questions of economics. If you want to understand the policy, part of what you have to understand is the people who actually enact the policy. So my goal in this book was to be on the ground, really get to know the people as best I could, tell their stories, and use that to inform our understanding of what is America doing with media in the Middle East, as opposed to looking at what the politicians say and sort of assuming it trickles down. Right? I wanted to go and see how it actually takes place and talk about how it becomes sort of a cycle where that influences the policy and the policy influences the people, and it keeps going around like that.